Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohen-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. The Holocaust Center, located in downtown Seattle, sits on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish are a large, loose grouping of many indigenous nations with numerous distinct cultures and languages that span the Pacific Northwest coast. Evidence of the Coast Salish people in this region dates back to 2000 BCE. Near Seattle, prominent settlements along the Duwamish River date to 600 CE and were inhabited continuously until the mid-1800s when a smallpox epidemic combined with forced relocation killed 60% of the population. We remember and recognize the original inhabitants and stewards of this land on which we now live. I want to thank our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors who helped to make these programs possible: the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. Special thank you to Gail Fox for her sponsorship of today's Lunch and Learn program. If you or your company are interested in being a sponsor for a Lunch and Learn program or even a series, let us know. Your support makes these programs possible. Last week, Friday, I received a call from the vice principal at my neighborhood high school where my son attends, West Seattle High School. A swastika was painted on a tree next to the school. Sure, teenagers will always push boundaries, but it's up to the adults in the room to draw the line and make the boundaries clear. I give the administrators at West Seattle High School tremendous credit for their swift condemnation of the act, for decidedly making it public and sending out resources to the students and the parents. As the principal explained in his response, they aim for zero indifference. Such actions are happening in schools and community spaces around the country. We must react. Zero indifference. This is not a time to shrug your shoulders and turn the other way. This is not the time to let this become routine. This is the time to draw the lines and make it clear what is tolerable and what is not. What does our society stand for? What are our values? Zero indifference. Take notice and react, even when it's hard or awkward or time-consuming. Do it anyway. Zero indifference is the goal. Each year, West Seattle High School hosts members of our Speakers Bureau to talk to their students. They send teachers to our teacher training workshops to learn about how to teach the Holocaust effectively and how to tie these lessons to contemporary issues of racism and bigotry and the difference each one of us can make. To help support Holocaust education and preserve the stories, we are giving away one of our new graphic novels that features the story of local Holocaust survivor Steve Adler. To tell you more is my wonderful colleague, Julia Thompson, our education program manager.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you for the opportunity to pop in here and your amazing introduction. So as Alana mentioned, More Than Any Child Should Know, a Kindertransport Story of the Holocaust, is the Holocaust Center's first graphic novel written specifically for students. It relates the story of local survivor Steve Adler and his journey from Germany to England on a Kindertransport, and then finally a new home in the United States. One educator who has used a Holocaust Center resource or attended a program of ours since the school year began will receive one copy of More Than Any Child Should Know today. This is our second time of doing a drawing live on the Lunch and Learn. The book is aimed at grades 5 and up and has accompanying teacher guide and lessons, which can be found on our website. So I'm going to use my random number generator once again. Let's see who we have today. All right, so congratulations to Therese Nolan from Enumclaw Middle School. You will receive a copy of More Than Any Child Should Know. And we will be emailing you shortly if you're not on this Lunch and Learn. Congratulations. More Than Any Child Should Know, if you're interested, can be purchased from your local independent bookstore via IndieBound, from Barnes & Noble, and elsewhere. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll hand it back to Alana.
Thanks a lot, Julia, and congratulations to Therese. We are so pleased to have with us today Richard Lowy to share his father's story. Richard's father, Leo, survived Auschwitz and the brutal experiments of Dr. Mengele, notorious for his obsession with twins. Leo's story of survival was nothing short of miraculous. Richard collected his father's testimony and learned his father's stories in order to share this history with others. In the following short 20-minute film, Richard will tell us his father's harrowing story of survival, but there's more. After the film, Richard will join us to tell us about the continuation of the story, a story that is still being uncovered. Richard will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in questions at any time. I'll now turn it over to Richard to tell us about his father, Leo.
I was born in 1928 in Carpathia, near the Hungarian border. We had a normal life. We had a nice, close Jewish family of about 50, both sets of my grandparents and my uncles and my aunts, all living in the same area. I had a twin sister. My oldest sister, Berta, well, she was married with a child, and I was an uncle. In October of 1938, the Czechoslovakian government ceased to exist in our country. And then the Hungarian regime came in, and I started getting Hungarian schooling. There was an element in the Hungarian regime that was obviously Jew haters. They had their own sign of hate, like the swastika, a different design. And they wore berets, and they identified themselves as militia. They caused us a lot of problems. I clearly remember how the panic set in because we were given the news about my uncle and my aunt and my two cousins who were taken from their home to a place in Poland because they didn't have the proper documents of citizenship of where they lived. I mean, they lived there their entire lives. They never moved. They never changed their citizenship. News filtered out that they were executed. And we couldn't accept that to be normal or human. One of my neighbors that was also taken, he knew my uncle, and he got the news out that he had witnessed him shot into a ditch. When the Hungarian regime came in, they had these people within the government that started robbing Jewish families, just coming and taking our belongings. Prominent Jews were taken into the synagogue for ransom, and they came to us, and we gave whatever we could, but it was obvious it did no good. Once we had given everything that we had and raised the funds to have these people released, we were taken. Early morning, they got to us. We were taken from our home into a brick factory. We were rounded up. We stayed in the brick factory for about 8 to 10 days, and then we were transported by cattle car, which at the time seemed like an endless trip from our hometown. I'd never left Baragova from the time I was born until I was taken in 1944. We were not told where we were going. We were just taken, thrown in 100 or more into a car with little food and no facilities of any kind. And they slammed the door shut, and we rolled on for days and nights to this destination. We arrived in the middle of the night, and they never opened the doors until morning. We were up most of the night listening to all the hollering and the dogs barking, and finally, when they did open the doors and we got down, we could barely move. Because for the few days that we were in these cars, we were in very, very cramped quarters, and the crying and the smell, and people were just standing there, and there was nowhere to go, and and the stench. This will be something that I'll never forget. We were lined up. When we got down along the tracks, in a long row in front of the trains. We had soldiers that were going up and down the pathway, and they were hollering. They were looking for people with abnormalities. And the first one they called out was Zwillinger, Zwillinger, twins. In all the commotion and all the excitement and the crying and the fear, my parents never realized that I was a twin with my sister. And maybe it was the fear, but they never gave out that they had twins. Lucky for me and my sister, my neighbor was standing right beside me, alongside of me, and she remarked that I have twins, and she did. She did have twins. She had twin daughters. But as it turns out, one of the daughters wasn't there. She was living in Budapest. But she had another daughter that was dressed the same, and she gave out the two girls as twins. And while she was doing that, she pointed at me and my sister that we were also twins because she knew us from birth. Right away, we were taken by the soldiers. No goodbyes to my parents or my sisters. We were yanked away and we were marched down the platform. No explanation. I walked past all my friends in school and my rabbi and my teacher, and we were taken to the front of the line. There was so much going on, and there were soldiers and officers at the front of the line, and then we were put into this van, and we were told that we would be reunited with our family at a later time in the day. Moments later, we were driven away. And shortly after, the van stopped, and I was taken from the van. My sister was still inside, and she was crying, and there was nothing I could do. I mean, I was pulled out of the van, and the van drove away. I was taken to the hospital barrack, the Krakenhaus barrack. And when we were inside, I sensed something was not right, simply because we're seeing a lot of people that looked like they were inmates, that they had been confined in there for what seemed like years. They came up and they were asking me all sorts of questions. Where did you come from? How was the trip? How were they treating you? What's going on in the outside world? Is there a war? How's it progressing? This was all very strange, and I knew something was not right, and so finally I followed one of them outside the barrack. And I insisted. I wanted to know what was happening here. One of the people, he pointed at the chimney. It was just a few hundred yards away, and they explained to me exactly what was happening. My parents, my oldest sister, my nephew, in this place, Auschwitz. I had to keep that secret to myself from my twin sister. I tried to protect her and not tell her what was happening. But from that day on, and for the duration that I was in Auschwitz, I never took my eyes off those chimneys. The following day, right away, we were taken to a separate place and visited by a Dr. Mengele, and then a team of doctors that numbered many, very many. Each day it seemed, for the duration of the time, which was about 9 months, that I was examined, day after day by a different doctor. I was given injections of various fluids, and I had blood samples taken from me, a lot of blood samples. I had gone through some experiences that I cannot say they were painful, but they were very scary. In my stage of life, I'd never really seen a doctor, let alone every day of the week being taken to a different place as a guinea pig for these various experiments. Some head to toe. Day after day, they would measure the different parts of our body. My hands, my bone structure, my hair. They took strands of my hair. They checked my eyes for color comparison. Just whatever you can imagine that a doctor would be able to do as far as an external experiment was concerned, or a comparison experiment, to relate to another set of measurements or blood tests, sometimes with my sister, sometimes not at the same time. The only thing that seemed the same and equally routine were the blood samples, and these I got to know. And not to fear them because I saw the tubes. They would take it before the needle, and then they would take the blood after the needle. And then in between, they injected me all over my body. The buttocks, my finger, and my my forearms and my spine, my rib areas, those hurt. And then more blood samples. And these they would take from the veins in my arms. They never explained. They always looked very closely at the different parts of my body, looking closely at the pigment of my skin. I can't tell you exactly what they had done or what they had injected or what they were looking for. But one thing was obvious. It was leading to bigger things and more serious things. Day after day, we'd get up in the morning in the barracks from our bunk beds, and we were crammed into these platforms with these tattered rags of blankets, crammed in with others. People were always getting up in the morning and looking around to see how many corpses there were from the night. Then roll call in front of the barracks with the capos. They were bad. Oh, these people were so cruel. They were worse than some of the guards themselves. And then after roll call, we'd be taken to the different parts of the camp for these different experiments, which were very scary because the rooms that we were taken to, they weren't laboratories. They were just dingy, gray, empty rooms. And there was always the fear, especially when we realized what they were capable of, what they had done and what I had witnessed with my own eyes, the beatings, and this in a hospital, in the Kraken House. I had seen daily as many as 50 to 100 corpses being taken out of the various barracks. So I was well aware of the fact that life meant nothing. These were bodies that were brought in from the various camps to this place. They didn't live for more than a few hours after they brought them in. Some of these people I recognized. They were from my hometown. They were transported in on the same trains. In some case, the older ones, the people who were there longer, they were just skin and bone. They weighed 80, 70, 60 pounds, and they couldn't talk, they couldn't eat. They were so weak. We tried to give them our rations, but it didn't do any good. It was the following morning when I went back to see them. They were out on the pile. As twins, we were treated a little more humanely because this Dr. Death, Dr. Mengele, needed us for his further experiments, which by our own deduction, call it our imagination, would have been leading to internal experiments, whereby they would have performed autopsies on us to compare the internal parts of our bodies to achieve whatever it is that they wanted to achieve. I'd seen a young male that was castrated as part of the experiments, and it was an ugly sight. It was pitiful. It's so scary. I realized that I was part of this program. I couldn't get it out of my mind. And seeing the site of the wound and the operation, or the result of the operation, I cannot recall if anything was done to me that was especially painful or sadistic. It was all measurements, injections, and blood tests, endless measurements, injections, and blood tests. And always being in front of a person in a white coat. There were no hellos, very cold gray rooms, no equipment, a number of doctors speaking a broken German. And of course, speaking Yiddish, I could understand what they wanted to know. Invariably, one would be a Greek, one would be a Czech or a Hungarian, and they would converse and they would take their papers, and there'd be an awful lot of secrecy. They would never discuss anything openly so that we could hear it. Some of the doctors were inmates, very humane. Some of them were Jewish, but they were victims of circumstances, and they were very scared. We were given the feeling that if they didn't do their job, their life would have been at stake for not completing it thoroughly. The fact that we were kept cleaner, we would be thoroughly cleaned up by people before being taken every day to a different experiment. That was very hard on me psychologically. That was the worst part. I was drained, emotional, physical. I was going down, starting to lose weight, even more so not only because of the diet, but the fear of not knowing what was going to happen next. There was this one time I was taken in the middle of the day and I was brought into a large medical room and I was cleaned up and laid out on an operating table. And there was another table that was beside me with a German soldier, and they put a tube into me and a tube into him, and they started transferring my blood to him. I had the misfortune of having a certain type of blood that matched his. I was on the table for an hour. It felt like they took all my blood out of me, whatever they could get. It was a very frightening situation. At the end of it, I was dragged out. They had to carry me out. I didn't have the strength to make it on my own. I didn't know when the day would be, if I would be returned and I'd be brought back with a limb missing or something had been done to me. When the real experiments would start, when I would be harmed bodily, physically, and that would be it. I remember this one incident. We started to panic, feeling the end would be near. It was late November or December of that year, and whatever was being done to us prior started to happen more frequently. And what I mean to say by that is that they take the entire group for the day, for the whole day, where before that, they would take smaller groups for shorter periods of time. But on this day, everybody had to be up for early morning roll call. And normally you just have the capo outside for the roll call, but on this day, there were German officers and lots of soldiers. These vans came up, no explanation. We all had to be ready, and we didn't know where we were going to be taken. We started saying our goodbyes, and we didn't know if we would be back at the end of the day. I was taken and put into a van, and we drove, this time for a longer time. And then we ended up what appeared to be a larger, more sophisticated looking facility. It looked more like the real thing. That was even more frightening, to realize that something was happening whereby they were speeding up the process. There were no explanations, and we were taken to this large waiting room, and my sister was there. And I sat beside my sister, and she was trembling. She was so frightened. And there would be about 5 or 6, 7 other sets of twins in the room with us. We never knew who was going in, or if they were going to do the same thing to each of us, or if it would be something different. And what seemed at random, we would be taken in. I appeared naked in front of this Dr. Mengele. He had his papers in front of him. He always had his papers in front of him. And the same people that were working on us during the week were standing by. He had questions to them that they answered rapidly. You could see the intensity on their faces when they were replying. I can't tell you what the exact discussions were because a lot of it was professional, medical. It didn't mean anything to me, but I could see that it was serious. The doctors themselves were very frightened, and they would give the report to Mengele, and he would examine the report, and then he would turn to me and examine me. He tried to give me the appearance that I wouldn't be scared. He was not loud. In fact, he was actually quite quiet when he was talking back and forth with the different doctors. He really never made conversation. He didn't ask me any questions. He never gave me a reason to believe that he tried to make me feel good. But while he was examining me, he tried to be pleasant. I knew he was not the man he portrayed. There is no doubt in my mind that his behavior was so that I wouldn't act abnormal or scared like a doctor or a scientist would be. In spite of everything, I was so emotionally frightened and scared. My heartbeat was never normal. I was never told what was going to take place. I'd never seen examinations of this nature, seen the various instruments, the scalpel, the bone saws, the large knives glaring at me in my face. And then he would look into my eyes with the lamp, whether it was the fear, whether it was the drugs, or what they had injected into me. I was weakened at all times. I was shaking as they were doing these things to me. I had these different feelings, of feeling woozy and blood rushing to my head. Each time I appeared before this Dr. Mengele, I knew the things he was capable of, the things he was already doing, that he was the one that was responsible for the choice of the thousands of people that were coming through, whether they were going to live or die, while he was inspecting these lines coming in. So when I appeared in front of him, standing naked, It was a very scary experience. Once a week, I was examined by Mengele. After I made it out of the room, they took us back to the barracks, and that's when we were discussing him amongst ourselves. And to say, whatever they did to me wasn't what I had expected. I'd lived through today, and we were just happy to come back out and see, thank God you made it out. Nobody knows what tomorrow brings. No matter how many needles that they jabbed me with, the injections of these various things, they just did these things to me. I never felt the same when I went in. I was just grateful that whatever they did not cut me. They did not take any part of my body. I was grateful it wasn't worse than what I had expected. The chimneys were for everybody. But we were a group in itself designated for other things that Mengele had in mind. I like to feel if it wasn't for the fact that I was a twin, I wouldn't be here today. I was small in stature. I wouldn't have survived it. I would have been designated for the chimney immediately. Plus, I don't think I would have survived the conditions that I had witnessed others had to live through. And they did not survive, most of them. On January 17th, 1945, we were taken on a march from Birkenau to Auschwitz, which was about a 5-kilometer march in heavy snow and bitter cold. And there were thousands of people in this march. And witnessing what they had done to the people that couldn't make the march, the people who fell down, the people who were too slow. We saw shootings, we saw beatings. So when we arrived into Auschwitz, I realized with 2 or 3 others that there's no way that I could make this march and survive. So we hid out in a basement for days. That's how I escaped. That's how I survived. Just me and my twin sister survived Auschwitz. My whole family, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, my parents, my oldest sister, my nephew, no one survived. My other sisters died in the death march. Having my twin sister survive has saved me. Had it not been for the fact that I was a twin, I probably wouldn't be here today to talk about it. There's no doubt in my mind, because all of my friends that I went to school with, that were my age, my crowd, they were all exterminated. They were all cremated. On that same day that I was standing by the barrack, looking at the chimney, they were all going up in smoke. There is nobody other than me and my twin sister that I know of my age group that survived. Nobody that I can find. From the 8,000 Jewish people that were taken from Barakova, 4 came back. My sister and I were 2. From what I understand, there are a few sets of twins that had survived that will bear me out and relay their stories too someday. I know that in my mind they will have their own stories to tell, and in some instances will be more horrible than what I had to tell you. This entire word-for-word account was transcribed from a 1985 interview with my father, who repeatedly stated, "I was never told what they were going to do to me or why." In 2000, I convinced my dad to go back to his hometown and tell the story of our family and the horrors of Auschwitz and the twin experiments. In the year 2000, we made the film Leo's Journey, the story of the Mengele twins. And when it broadcast in Israel, a phone rang in an apartment, and the lady answered the phone, and she called to her husband, who was in the front room watching TV, and she says, "It's your sister on the line." She says, "There's a film about the Mengele twins on the TV, you should watch it." And he yells back, "I don't need to, I was there." He was a Mengele twin. But out of curiosity, he turned the channel to watch this documentary. And he says at 5 minutes and 2 seconds into the film, he drops his food on the floor and he yells to his wife, "It's my lipa, it's my lipa, quick, come see." It turns out he's been looking for his lipa for 56 years because lipa helped save his life in the camps. Lipa was a nickname given to my father, Leo, by his grandfather. So Kalman would have never found him. And now because of the film, he's found his lipa. A phone rang in Vancouver. My mother answered the phone and she gives it to my father and she says, "There's somebody on the phone. He says he knows you from the camps." My father took the phone and the only thing the man said was, "Are you my lipa?" In May of 2002, we reunited Kalman and Lipa, and they told their story on national news so the world could learn. At the making of this film on January 27th, 2020, I just recently got news that Kalman had passed away 5 weeks ago. The reason that I wanted to tell my father's story is that I believe that this is an opportunity to learn and to share and to talk about these things. We have the opportunity for change. We have the opportunity to stop the rise of hatred, simply in our classrooms, out on the streets, when we're with our friends. It's the decisions that we make together are the decisions in our life that will build a better world for all of us. So no one else has to take Leo's journey. I was shocked when I found out from my parents that someone had called the house. And I was over for dinner and I was talking with mom and dad and mom says, "Oh, by the way, someone called dad from the camp." And I went, "Someone called dad from the camp?" He says, "Yeah, this boy, this man called and said he wanted to talk to dad." And so it was just kind of a matter of, oh, just in passing, somebody had called and wanted to talk to dad. And I found out that this man, Kalman from Israel, had phoned after he'd seen the film, had called the house, and dad was a little confused. Dad had dementia towards the end of his life and as he was getting older, and he didn't remember a lot. And Kalman is on the other side of the phone and he's saying that, "Do you remember me? I am Kalman Baran. I am from Israel, and I was in Birkenau with you. I worked in the guard shack with you." And dad's kind of sort of remembering, and then Kalman says, "Lipa, it's Kalman." And at that point, my dad was just kind of silent, and no one has called him Lipa since Birkenau, so after the war. Because the rest of the family was gone. We never knew that that was dad's name, never heard of it. And dad started remembering things. So I got in touch with Kalman and I followed up with him, and dad was slowly started remembering things. And in the presentation you just watched, dad never mentioned anything about being in this guard shack. And when Kalman started to remind him, it was this information started coming forward, and dad started remembering, and he started remembering these days. And I mean, can you imagine, I'm sitting here going, not only do we have dad's story, which is amazing, but now we have this other boy that spent 6.5 months with dad, collaborating his story and talking about dad and giving his observation of what dad was like inside the barrack. And after talking with Kalman, it was decided, dad really can't travel, but Kalman worked at LL in the later part of his life. And because he was retired, he still had some opportunity to fly. So he said, "Look, I will come to Vancouver." And in May of 2002, we reunited dad with Kalman. And as you can imagine, it was quite the story. And I was able to get about 6 hours of them together telling their story videotaping them. And that was May of 2002, and Dad passed away in December of 2002. And shortly after that, the following year, I talked with Kalman and I decided, to fly to Israel. And I got 10 hours of interview footage with Kalman in his home in Israel, telling his entire story. And what was fascinating was that Kalman was a yeshiva, he calls himself a yeshiva bucher, a yeshiva kid. At a very young age, he went to a yeshiva. He was very learned. Every day, his grandfather would make sure that he learned the Talmud and the Torah and the stories. So he was a very well-spoken man. Even in his broken English, he was telling great descriptions of the stories of growing up and what it was like in the ghetto and his trip into Birkenau and meeting my father. And I've had this footage for years, and I used the footage. I tried to make a film. I tried to get some people interested, and some people were a little interested, etc. But never really made the film. And so when COVID hit a couple of years ago, it started, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back and maybe start editing some of this film. And I thought, it's kind of hard to edit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to transcribe it. So for the last 2 years, I've been transcribing Dad's testimony, which we had when we made Leo's journey. The story of the Mengele twins, not in my father's words, when we made the actual film, Leo's journey. I have the interview footage from Dad and Kalman together, and then I have Kalman's 10 hours of interview footage. And the interesting thing is that when you start reading a transcript and you start cleaning it up and taking out all the duplicate words and the questions and all the confusing statements, all of a sudden, the story starts revealing itself. And I'm watching this, and all of a sudden, this great detail of this eyewitness testimony of Kalman and Dad start coming together. I'm going to share with you now a little bit of Kalman's testimony. And this is still a work in process. I have a long way to go in finishing this document. I'm about 70% the way through, but I will give you a little sample of some of Kalman's testimony. The pajama walks me a fair distance from the train ramp, finally plucks me down in front of a building with a French window next to the entrance of one of these barbed wire fence camps. And he says, "Stand here." And then he's gone. I'm standing by myself, and there's no one around for a minute or so. And I notice an SS guard behind the French window. He gets up, steps out, walks up to me and says, "You understand German?" "Jawohl." He says, "Go in there," pointing to a large size hut next to the gate inside the camp. He orders me, "Open the gate, go present yourself in there," which I do. It's a large metal gate, not locked, with barbed wire. I shove it open a bit and push it, and then I pull it closed behind me. I walk to the big house, more than double the size of a house with a large wooden door, and I step in. I'm faced with a large room. It's more than a room, it's a hall. And I stand just inside the door. 2 or 3 people at desks. It looks like an administrative thing. And there's a pajama sitting at a table with all kinds of weird machines and pens, and he beckons, "Come here, little Jew." I stood on the other side of the desk in his broken Yiddish. "Put your arm on the table, don't move." I did as I was told. He says, "Don't be afraid, it'll hurt a little." He pulls my arm down and holds it to the desk, grabbing one of the pens and starts poking me. It hurt a lot. He was very brutal. It was like a needle. Each touch left a colored point. He's tattooing my arm with his pen. He's making up a number. I had to make a real effort not to squirm because it was painful. He gave me my number, A14096. I didn't know what the number was. Raus, out. I get up and another pajama takes me outside. Brings me about halfway into the camp. He says, "This is your place. Get in there." It's another hut, another wooden door. I step in. I'm hit by a brick wall of smell and sights. The smell especially. The smell outside was bad. This was brutal. A combination of urine and feces, rot, the most awful combination ever. I meet this for the first time.
And the sights were even worse. I begin to realize what I'm facing. 2 rows of bunks, 1 on each side of the hut, 3 levels. And on each one of these flats, somewhere between 5, 7 people, some of them on their bellies looking out at me on their elbows, others on their backs. And then I realized the sound, the moaning. Terribly confused. Remember, I am a yeshiva boy who stepped out of the pages of the Talmud 6 weeks ago, and now I'm standing here like a turkey with no instructions, gaping. A few minutes go by, and a boy walks up to me, a small fellow, no more than 3 feet tall with glasses. As he comes near, I realize he's not a boy. He's a grown-up. How do I know? He's all wrinkled up. When I look at him, I see he has old hands. He's full of wrinkles. And I realize his whole body is old. He's a dwarf. With a friendly smile, he approaches me and straight away in Hungarian, "What's your name? Where are you coming from?" My name is Coleman Brown. I come from Balassageremat. We just arrived this morning. I don't know where everybody is. The rest of my family, they disappeared. They dressed me in these rags and they did this to me. And I hold up my arm, and the pajama who brought me here said, "You belong here." And now I'm here. He says, "Yes, you belong here. Come." And he takes me by the hand and leads me to a bunk down the left side of the hut. And he says to me, "Here, this is my place." It was on the lower bunk. He couldn't climb up to the middle bunk, let alone the high one. He was only 3 feet tall. He was an adult man, but with a kind but a high-pitched voice. And he says, "I am Lajos Feld. I come from the township of Koisi, Slovakia, and I am here like you for the same fate." This is Lajos Feld. He says, I said, "I have an auntie named Feld, Auntie Esther. She's married to Rabbi Yitzhak Feld." Lajos says, "He's my brother." He says, "You can call me Lajos Bachi." In English, Uncle Lajos. "We are mishpacha, we're family. This is our place. You will sleep on the inside, I will sleep on the outside, and from now, we are a pair." He is smart. Later on, I find out just how smart. Lajos Bachi tells me, this is the place where twins are collected and kept by this officer. They call him Dr. Mengele. I am also some of the people who this doctor is collecting for his medical things. He says, "All right, don't worry. I will watch over you. I will show you the ropes." And for the first time in a while, I'm relieved, but I didn't know what was coming. Roll call. More than a week later, 5 a.m. roll call. An SS soldier strolls up to our block and the capo stands mad at attention, yells out commands, "Stand in line, get in order." Everybody stands, soundless, as tall as you can be. Fear of God Almighty. An SS soldier inside the camp, an SS guard strolls down the line and he passes me and he points at me with his cane and walks on. I didn't move. I just stood there, not knowing what was happening. He does the same thing down the line and then he disappears. The capo shouts orders, "Everybody except you and you." For the second time, I'm left standing alone with this other boy while the capo was moving everyone back inside. "Where are you from?" "Balassageremat." He says, "You?" "Baraksas." "Who are you?" "I'm Kalman." "I'm Leopold." "Are you a twin?" He says, "Yes, with my sister." "Me too." He's questioning me. Lipa was shorter than I was, thin. He was wearing shmatas like I did. When I took notice with him, what I took notice with him was his eyes, constantly moving, looking. When he spoke to me, he did not just look at me. He did for a second or two, but then he looked around, all around. In other words, he was using his eyes to case, to inspect, to interpret what's in front of him. He did that every day, 100 times a day. The capo came over. "Quickly, get to the main gate. Present yourself in front of the guard shack." "Jawohl." Lipa walks in front of me and opens the gate. We walk out of the camp. And from then on, he was my Lipa. He was always a half a step ahead of me. Fast forward through a number of the months. It's now October 7th, 1944, and they're in the guard shack. We are now the first week of October and the weather is getting harsher. It was quite a routine, cold, rainy, drizzly day. Bad day. I was busy with a pair of army boots and Lipa was finishing in front. He was asked to wipe the floor again around the coal stove of the guard room up front. He was there and I was in the tail end of the shack, and a tremendous explosion shook everything around us, a huge noise, everything rattled. Lipa came running back and the two of us sort of hunched in the storeroom and we waited it out. What's going on? Around us, all the soldiers, the whole team raced out of the guardroom towards Canada, which was just about 100 yards from us. We were left alone. Lipa grabbed me by the collar and said, "Come." And we went outside and we went around the back of the guard shack and stood there, not too close to the fence, with our faces looking at the crematorium. The place was one big smoky area, a little bit of flames, not large ones. The whole thing was a huge heap of rubble. Around it, pajamas racing out towards the woods, and the soldiers, both from Canada and others, came running with rifles, small arms fire, left, right, and center, looking completely mad to us. A short while later, maybe 10, 15 minutes, a host of vehicles tearing down the road, lining up, many soldiers, all with firearms. And there's a methodical chase after the Sonder commando. We understood this is an uprising. And we stood here, the two little mice, forgotten by everyone, outside the electrified fence. We were at our workplace, just like we knew how to stand there when there was a selection. We stood here. Why? Because we could see. There were other explosions too, tearing open the electrified fence. The guard from the tower kept shooting this way. There was a lot of soldiers running up and firing away in small arms fire. Less and less people were running. They were still running to the forest. They shot anybody that moved, some of them just lying on the ground. We couldn't make sense of this until a fair amount of time later, when the place was full of guards and the firing stopped, and everybody who would be caught was killed. And Dad talked about the blood transfusion inside his story. He kept telling me the story about the blood transfusion over and over again, and I couldn't understand, what was going on. And one time he said, I think it was at the time of the uprising, it turns out that after that uprising, they were sent back to their barrack, and from the barrack, a soldier came and took father away over to the crematorium in Dr. Nishley's area, and they did a blood transfusion for one of the soldiers that was injured during the uprising. I would have never figured this out if it wasn't for Kalman's story, Dr. Nishley's story, and Dad's story, and starting to put it together. So all of this information is coming together, and I am now trying to make sense of it all and bring all these transcripts together. And it's like a detective trying to figure out what really happened, and it's coming together. Thank you for the time. I'd like to thank Lana and Richard and the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity for doing this, and Gail Fox for sponsoring the program and giving me the opportunity to tell my father's story and a bit of Kalman's story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. This story is just really incredible and heartbreaking. There have been a few questions, and I'm wondering as well, can you tell us a little bit about your father's sister and what was her experience, and what happened to her as well after Auschwitz?
Well, unfortunately, like a lot of the women, other than Eva Kor, and there were some that would speak about it, my Auntie Miriam never spoke of what happened to her. She was taken on the death march with her other three sisters, and they were liberated by the Americans. Unfortunately, the Americans didn't know, and they fed them. And over the week just after they were liberated, my Auntie Miriam watched her three sisters die in front of her. Auntie Miriam was a very troubled person. At the end of her life, she was in a senior citizen's home, and how she died was she choked because she would hoard her food, trying to keep her food and everything, and somebody didn't notice it, and she choked, and she had a very, very tragic life. Very sad, but we didn't know a lot of her story. And Kalman would tell about his sister Judith, who was in the same barrack that Miriam was in, and she never spoke of her story either. There was one story that she did tell, and when Dad and Kalman were inside the guard shack, at the end of these meals, they would clean the tables and they would get the scraps of food and they would throw the food over the fence to Miriam and to Judith. And so they got a little extra food. And one day in the guard shack, believe it or not, they had a Christmas party in December. And Kalman was able to get a piece of poppy seed cake And when him and his sister were younger, sitting at the table in grandfather's house, they would share poppy seed cake. And so Kalman took the piece of poppy seed cake and threw it over the fence to Judith. And she was shocked. And that was the only story that she would tell after the war, was the time that Kalman threw her a piece of poppy seed. Like, where do you get poppy seed cake in Auschwitz? So
I'm really struck by your father kind of expressing again and again just the extreme fear and how that plays into just the not knowing, and that itself wears you down day after day after day. And I wonder, like, as his son and growing up with him, did you see this kind of expressed later in his life as well?
No. Dad lived a life of humor. He was always the funny guy. In synagogue, he would sit there telling jokes, and the rabbi would hit the pulpit and tell everybody, hey, you guys behave. And my dad would turn to the other guys and go, shh, even though it was him causing the disturbance. I know that from Mom, that there were times when Dad did speak about it. He would do some lecturing. He would start sweating in the evening. So he was obviously having some bad nightmares, and he would wake up in a pool of sweat. And Dad suffered a couple of big angina attacks and had to have heart surgery. And unfortunately, where they were living in their house at the time, the bedroom was upstairs. And they had, you know how you have the big mirrors for the closet? Well, when the paramedics came upstairs, they couldn't get the dolly upstairs to take him out. So they had to pick him up and carry him out. And so my dad would see in the mirror these two uniforms picking him up and carrying him out. And for months after that, he had a lot of trouble sleeping. My mom would tell us stories about him. But to us, we never knew his story growing up. He never spoke about it. He didn't sit us down. We just knew that he was in the war and that he survived. And back in those days, people didn't know. Back in the 70s and the 80s, people weren't freely talking about the Holocaust. There were a few, but we were only starting to get a little bit of this trickling out of some of these stories.
Did it ever become clear what they were injecting him with, or, you know, what were their goals with these experiments?
No, there was speculation. Like, we found Dad's documents afterwards, and one said vitamin C. We don't know what the injections were. I don't think they ever found out. I know that from Kalman's story that a couple of his injections would be extremely painful, and they would create these blotches on his skin. You know, the things that they tell us is that they were trying to figure out how to duplicate twins. How could we make twins so we can duplicate the Aryan nation? And if every German woman had a twin, it could repopulate Germany. But again, that's all hearsay, and who really knows?
Well, Richard, one last question for you here, and that is, if your father were with us today, what do you think he would tell us? What would he want to leave us with here?
It's like what you said right at the very beginning, that we cannot accept anything, zero tolerance, because words matter. And when Kalman and when Dad were growing up, they were just words. They were words of hatred. They were words of threats, but they weren't, you know, they were accepting them at those times. That's the way it was, you know, and so they accepted them. And knowing what we know today, we cannot allow those words to be spoken in schools, you know, in newspapers, on radio programs. And you hear of all these people who have these, you know, these views of racism, intolerance, and, you know, what's happening around the world. And it's not just, you know, the Jews, and it's the First Nations and the residential schools that they're discovering in Canada, and the African Americans, and what happened, you know, back during the slavery period. And the Germans were able to take it to the next level. The others probably would have if they could have. And Dad's was always to stand up and say, you know, words matter, and we must stand up against those words.
Richard, thank you so much for being a part of our program. I want to read you a comment that just came in on the chat that came from Mary, and she says, I'm so grateful that you are able and willing to share the story of your amazing father. He sounds like a remarkable man with great courage. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Richard. We look forward to seeing this additional work you're doing on Cullman and hopefully hearing more about this story and filling in some of the pieces. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for joining today's program. This program was recorded and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow. Programs like these are possible because of the generous support of our donors. And if you found today's program interesting, please consider making a donation to help support more programs like this one. You can make your donation quickly and easily on our website, and you'll find a link in the chat. Our next Lunch and Learn program on March 1st begins a new 6-part series entitled Understanding and Disrupting Genocide. We will hear from leading scholars, activists, and people with boots on the ground. Join us for the first program in the series on Tuesday, March 1st, with Voices from Srebrenica, Survivor Narratives of the Bosnian Genocide. Programs in this series will take place on the 1st and 3rd Tuesdays of March, April, and May. You can join us for the live programs on the Tuesdays or stream them at your convenience on our website. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who is running the technical side of this show. Also, a huge thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Paul Regelbrug, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devonshire Lockey, Katie Lawrence, and Ali Laps. Thank you again for joining today's program. We look forward to seeing you at our next Lunch and Learn on March 1st. And this concludes our program for today.